You look at all of the different sciences and the bigger picture in totality, you do get this picture of a purposeful universe heading towards some possibly ultimate goal state, some sort of cosmic attractor where maybe something like a cosmic mind emerges after life has spread throughout the universe and forms this sort of integrated mind at a cosmic level. Well said. It's interesting that Thomas Aquinas took Aristotle's philosophy. He was heavily influenced by Aristotle, and I think Aristotle was right about a lot of things. And it's interesting that that might be part of the success of Christianity, was that kind of teleological worldview. But yeah, there is this drive, and this drive is ultimately due to this intrinsic process of complexification that I think is the process of the universe. It's not this static thing that's becoming increasingly disordered. It's this thing that's becoming more and more complex, and life and consciousness are the drivers of this complexification process.
Azarian, how's it going?
Hi, Ethan. It's going good. You can call me Bobby.
Oh, okay. Well, it's nice to see you. I've been looking forward to chatting with you for quite some time. So thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this too.
I made it through your book recently, and it's really fascinating to me because I was able to find a scientist such as yourself who was kind of dispensing with the same types of notion and definition of consciousness. So what I wanted to start this off with was how do you see consciousness and define consciousness? I know it's a kind of loaded question, but I think it's a good place to start to kind of segment mind and body, and how those interplay between those two works with your definition of consciousness.
Okay, and so we're rolling already? Okay. So yeah, that's a complicated question because everybody has a different definition of consciousness. But I think the most useful definition that causes the least confusion is that consciousness refers to what it is like to be something. And so if something is having subjective experience, if there is a cohesive, unified view of reality, then something is conscious. So when I say what is it like to be something, that comes from the philosopher Thomas Nagel, who wrote a wonderful essay in the late 70s, I think, called What It Is Like to Be a Bat. So you could imagine being a bat or a cat, and you could imagine that they have some sort of field of experience where there might not be anything it is like to be a rock or a chair. Of course, some people who support panpsychism might argue with that, but I feel pretty certain that we can say that there's nothing it's like to be a rock. And so this ability to experience the world is not something trivial. It's something that requires information processing and integration, and we see that in living systems.
Absolutely. Yeah, that definition of consciousness is what led to the hard problem being coined by David Chalmers, was this idea of subjective experience being unanswerable. We could kind of explain with neural correlates of consciousness, I think, the easy problem, as they call it, but subjectivity is what presented this enigma of the hard problem.
Exactly.
How we can generate a subject as such as I in our landscape of being. And some people may not see that as too enigmatic, or a lot of times people probably overlook the hard problem or take for granted subjectivity. So sometimes this problem doesn't even resonate with a lot of folks because it's so obvious to them, or it's so intrinsic to them, that the problem of subjectivity doesn't really come about.
Yeah, it's really interesting too, because I guess it's just, where soon as we become aware, like soon as, our consciousness is there, then we're having an experience, And we kind of take that for granted because we just, think that is like the default state of existence. So yeah, I think a lot of people just don't recognize the hard problem as being a problem. But it's funny because if you ask those people, like, is it like anything to be a rock or to be a grain of sand? Most of them will think that those aren't conscious, but they probably haven't even thought of it in that way until you present that to them. And then once you kind of frame it in those terms, then they can see, oh, okay, there's something special about subjective awareness.
Yeah. No, yeah, then they can kind of start to gather from that what's so odd about it. Because from a evolution by natural selection perspective, you would presuppose humans to be philosophical zombies, as they call it. You would suppose us to have been almost automatons that operate. Sure, we can navigate the environment using our senses. However, why would the color red? Why would the taste of chocolate? Why would certain things trigger certain subjective elements in me and different ones in you? That's kind of where it comes down to, is if you look at it materialistically, there's no reason why consciousness would have produced a subject in its environment instead of just being this homeostatic organism that drives to reproduce, eat, and all of those things. So to me, I think the crux of it kind of arises there is if you're materialistic and you're evolutionary and everything's an accident and all of that, and then why would you not suppose it to be a zombie, like a robot? Why would we have had all of these altruistic tendencies and all of these things that really don't add anything to our own fitness? We kind of help other. It's kind of an odd thing.
Yeah, and even at another level, if you take the kind of hard reductionist stance, you would say everything is made of particles, and these particles are knocking into each other and bouncing around and interacting. But what about the interaction of these fundamental elements creates a field of experience? So it is kind of mysterious. But when we get into talking about evolution, yeah, it's also not completely obvious why you would have consciousness. But I think once you start to understand what consciousness allows, which is kind of a higher level form of cognition that allows organisms to simulate different possible future trajectories in their mind, then you start to see an evolutionary reason for why consciousness emerged. So when you're thinking about where you might be in 5 years and you're trying to set goals in your life, maybe you got a job offer and you're trying to think about whether it's a good decision to take a job, let's say, in a different country. What you usually do, or what you should do, I think, is try to imagine yourself in that place. Try to imagine if you would be happy. Try to imagine, how your life will be different. And if you don't do that exercise, it's really hard to make an informed decision. So there is a reason that we do kind of simulate these different possible futures in our mind when we're trying to make a hard decision. And I think that ability to do that, to kind of project into the future or travel back into the past, it's known as mental time travel. I don't think lower animals have that capacity. So I think consciousness is something that emerges and it becomes richer over time. And there's an actual function that gets selected for, because you could imagine that humans that have a better ability to think about the future and to plan and to think about long-term consequences of their actions have a survival advantage over those that don't do that.
Yeah, no, I see. So it's a functionalistic look at the equation, kind of, to where what function is consciousness solving in a grand scheme of evolutionary fitness. Being able to plan, being able to simulate and model a future as opposed to the present, and then act in accordance with that would increase your longevity over, most certainly, if you were to take a better job because you had this metacognitive look at yourself and your environment in the future, essentially that could, that could make you, your longevity increase, and you'd be able to have more progeny. And so evolution would select for this almost like a functionalistic perspective, to where the function of consciousness is predicated on.
Yeah, so I think there's a function, and when you start talking in these terms about simulating futures, I think you start to make some progress on the hard problem, because now we're talking about simulations. And I don't think any system can just run simulations. Again, I don't think a chair or a rock can run simulations. And I don't think a single-celled organism can run simulations of the future. It requires more advanced cognitive machinery. So when you start to understand that the brain is this information processing system that has these synaptic connections that create an internal model of the external world, then you start to understand how subjective experience arises. It's this model that's been built up through evolutionary processes, because natural selection is something like an information channel that pumps information from the environment into organisms that have to model the world to stay far from thermodynamic equilibrium. And so I think that's how we make progress in the hard problem, to start understanding that our brains encode a mental model of reality.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense as well. It's interesting to me, the idea of emergence, though, as it pertains to consciousness in a certain way, just because it's so foreign and abstract from physical matter to me. And I guess that's the materialism versus idealism or panpsychism split. Or, like Descartes had that, basically separated the mind and body for the first time. And then the West tried to make it more monistic by materializing it all. So everything was material first, and gave rise to what we have now. And so looking into consciousness it seems to me like potentially there's an element of consciousness present at the most basic single cellular level, just by movement. I was making these connections with anesthesia and things like that, and kind of got to this point to where it looks to me like consciousness and movement have some sort of connection. And I didn't know if you saw it similar to that, or if you've thought about that before.
Yeah, I definitely think they do. And embodied cognition is a hot area of research in the computational neuroscience world. And artificial intelligence researchers are starting to understand the importance of embodiment. So yeah, I think there's this active inference paradigm that was made popular by the neuroscientist Carl Friston. And so the idea is that an organism, let's say a human, when you're doing all of these behaviors, and especially when you're first born and you're learning things, each of these actions are like an experiment. And basically it's a form of reality testing, because your behavior might or might not get you to your goal. And so in response to the results of that little experiment, you update your internal model to be a more accurate representation of the world. So action is how the model that ultimately becomes the seat of conscious experience gets built up. And you can see single-celled organisms themselves as miniature experiments, kind of evolutionary experiments. So each organism has a genome, which is basically a genetic program that is a sort of strategy for survival or staying far from thermodynamic equilibrium. And so, yeah, it's very important that organisms are embodied, and actions are how this model gets built up. But I'm not quite sure that consciousness starts with single-celled life. When I started writing my book, The Romance of Reality, that was the position that I took. I kind of assumed that, because with the origin of life, that's the moment that you see intelligent behavior. So for example, a simple bacterium will perform what's called chemotaxis. And chemotaxis is when a bacterium will swim away from toxins and towards molecular food. So you already see this little, minuscule bit of intelligence and cognition, even with single-celled organisms, even prokaryotic organisms, very simple organisms. But so when we ask whether it's conscious, it gets back to that definition of consciousness. I definitely think these simple organisms have mind in the sense that they're doing information processing, but whether there's an actual subjective experience there, I'm not sure, because the argument I make in the book is that an internal model isn't good enough to give you subjective experience. The model has to start modeling itself. And it's that process of self-modeling which creates a viewer. So you can imagine conscious experience as being like this theater of experience. There's kind of this, virtual simulation of the world. But you could also imagine like a movie theater with no one in the audience, and it would just be, images being projected, but nothing to actually experience those images. So in the book, I argue that consciousness defined as subjective experience might have emerged with brains, but that cognition emerged with life.
I see. Yeah. So that drawing that line between cognition, consciousness, intelligence, even allows it to kind of look at consciousness in levels potentially, or there's like phenomenal consciousness, self-consciousness. And that's kind of how I've been thinking of it. Is it seems like language as an advent in humans, obviously the only species that utilizes language as advanced as we do. That's whenever we were able to begin attributing this notion of I and yourself and you to these individual objects. Because without language, it seemed hard for me to tell how self-consciousness could have arisen, and how we even really know that we have consciousness is by, if you say a sentence like I'm tired of myself or something, and you've got an I and a self, yourself in there, it's an odd notion to self-reference yourself twice. It's almost like people innately assume themselves to be riding around as a passenger in their head, and the brain is like a secondary. It's like if you have pain in your leg, it's like, well, my leg hurts my brain. And just, you repeat the same pronouns, like you're experiencing this phenomena twice.
Yeah.
And that's kind of odd.
Yeah, it is strange. And I do think there are these levels of awareness that emerge at different times in the evolutionary story. So yeah, self-consciousness would come later. And I think language is probably a necessary component of that. But I do think, cats and dogs. Okay, so I would say like everything with a brain, possibly not everything, but most things with brains are probably conscious as far as having some subjective field of experience, like ants, maybe even worms, bees, certainly cats and dogs. But then another level of awareness, which would be kind of this self-consciousness, would come with language. But, dogs certainly have their own language, their own system of, communicating with symbols. So I would say that some higher animals, certainly dolphins, probably octopuses and squid, octopi.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that they could have self-consciousness as well. And then with human language, you just get this other level where you're always referring to I. And I think that's like sort of the beginning of metacognition, which I guess would be kind of a self-aware, an awareness of self-awareness.
Yeah.
It's kind of loopy to
Yeah.
talk about because you have these levels of recursion, and yeah, it is very strange. But yeah, I think there are these different levels, and the higher up you go, basically the system is starting to look back at itself, and you get this interesting sort of meta awareness.
Yeah, exactly. That's what makes it so phenomenal. The consciousness aspect is that metacognition, because it's so hard to understand that if everything's materialistic, how some material rearranged itself in a way that it can reference itself just seems like if anything would emerge, that would be the last thing to emerge, because of how odd it really is.
Yeah, it's super strange, but I think if you understand these levels of self-awareness, or not self-awareness, these levels of awareness as being something that allows the system to persist in a chaotic world, then it becomes a little less mysterious. Um, but I think part of solving that mystery is that it's not quite exploring evolution isn't exploring configurations of systems completely randomly.
Yeah,
So even with the origin of life, you have this process called dissipative adaptation that basically is how a simple chemical system starts to evolve into something like an autocatalytic set, which would be a self-sustaining chemical reaction system, which is probably a precursor to the first cell, something like a protocell. You start to see that basically a system being pushed by a flow of energy will start moving through this space of possible configurations, but the configurations that allow the system to extract energy from the environment are the ones that get selected for. And so then you get something like an adaptive process. And later in evolution, you have all these different forms of organisms, and they're competing for survival, and natural selection weeds out the systems that aren't good at sustaining themselves against this tide of entropic decay. And so selection is kind of a process. It's kind of a filter that makes this process non-random. And so configurations that refer to themselves, that somehow encode their own structure, seem to be selected for by natural selection, because there is this survival advantage to becoming aware, and then self-aware, and then meta-aware.
yeah, understood. Yeah, that makes sense too. Is that, yeah, there is a survival advantage. One puzzling thing that I find with the notion of that being a survival or a fitness advantage is just, I guess, centered around the problem, or the amount of problems that arise between societies, humans, individuals, because of self-consciousness. I mean, self-consciousness might be the reason that we end up nuking the whole world. And what, I mean, that would be because of a pride or an ego issue, or some, villainous leader getting upset that he's about to die and pushing a nuke code. Now that's a little bit dramatized, but I mean, it's like if humans ever do obliterate themselves, it will be due to some issue that is directly emergent from self-consciousness. And it also delivers so much pain and suffering in the world for people who dominate, abuse people who, there's a lot of terrible, terrible non-selective fitness aspects of this idea of feeling subjectively that come about, that becomes a little bit difficult to explain too, because we're our own worst enemy at certain extents, and same thing with others towards us, all because of how self-conscious one person may be in the world.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. I hadn't really thought about it like that in terms of consciousness, but now that you say it, I guess it's similar to technology. It can be used for good or bad, but it expands our capabilities dramatically. And I guess you could say the same thing for
Yeah.
self-consciousness. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you're going to have, if the selective advantage is even 51%, and the deselective advantage of self-conscious 49, you're going to see the, obviously. Um,
Yeah, it's you get the full package. So I guess, you get all of these adaptive features, but it just expands the organism's capabilities, and that expansion can be used for good or bad, I guess.
yeah, no, yeah. And then the question at that point comes about is what's good and what's bad. And looking into good and bad, or evil and good, is another issue that comes back to consciousness and philosophy a lot of times, because it's hard to define what good and bad really is. And it seems to me like that discussion on good and bad it's such a human, it's a high level conversation that involves definitely the most highest hierarchical structures of our brain. Like when you're engaging in conversation like that, you're using the most of consciousness you can possibly use, and you're discussing the origins of good, bad, and evil. Those things to me seem like arbitrary conversations unless you acknowledge there's some sort of purpose or meaning to sorry about that, to our existence.
Yeah,
weird.
I think so. I was thinking about this a lot, kind of halfway through the book when I was on the part that discusses evolution. The book is broken up into 3 parts. The first part's origins, then evolution, and then transcendence. And what I kind of realized is you can't have a notion of good without a notion of bad or evil or something, because good is kind of meaningless unless there is a spectrum to compare good to. So you can also think about so I found it very useful to think about the brain having a mental repertoire of states. And this was kind of influenced by integrated information theory, a theory of consciousness from neuroscience. But it seems that intelligence corresponds to more accessible states in your mental repertoire. And that was just, kind of led me to this idea that to understand anything, you kind of need to understand its opposite. And I think that kind of goes with reality. For anything to have any sort of meaning, there needs to be the opposite, because that sort of defines what that thing is. But it is very strange that we do have these notions of good and bad. And I do think, like you said, it kind of paints a picture of purposeful existence. Going a little farther than that, I do think there's this moral arc to evolution, such that as organisms become increasingly intelligent, they become more self-aware, they become meta-aware. And when I use meta-aware, I mean that they're aware that they're self-conscious agents that are in a network, an interconnected network of a collection of self-conscious agents. And so part of intelligence is what's called a theory of mind, having a theory of mind. So you understand that other organisms are not just inanimate systems like a rock or a chair. You understand there are other things with their own beliefs, desires, and conscious experience. And I think when you understand that, then sort of morality emerges, a kind of humanism type morality, where you realize that you don't want other things to suffer because you don't want to suffer yourself. So I do think that assuming that our civilization continues to exist and progress, we will become a more moral society. And if there were intelligent beings on some other planet in the universe, this evolutionary trajectory would apply to them as well.
I see. Yeah. So you're like you say in your book, and what you're trying to kind of propagate with this theory or this ideology is that the universe itself wakes up to itself, that it in itself is evolving, that consciousness is something to do universally, not necessarily panpsychist, of course, like or idealist, like consciousness is all there is, but that the universe inevitably becomes more complex, as you call it, the complexity science. Can you talk a little bit about complexity science and what that means with the merging of all these fields, computer science, philosophy, all of this, what that means to you and your model of the universe?
Okay, yeah, great. And then I guess we can come back to this idea of like the universe waking up, because when people hear that, they're like, what do you mean by that? Maybe I should start with that first, actually, since you mentioned that first, and then come back to complex adaptive systems, because it is important to understand that we're a complex adaptive system and that these systems exist at these different scales. And that's what kind of gives us a sort of unifying paradigm. Yeah, to break down that concept of the universe waking up, because it's kind of what the book is based on. As I said, I don't think consciousness exists in the universe at the very beginning, at least defined as an agent with subjective experience. I think it emerges. But I do think the evolutionary process is progressive and leads to increasingly complex forms. So as life spreads, living things are conscious. And so consciousness spreads as life spreads throughout the universe. And there's no real limits to how far life can spread as long as they have the ability to continually extract the energy that the system needs to sustain itself. So when I say the universe is waking up, I'm not saying that it's waking up in this traditional panpsychic sense, which would be the universe waking up outside of life. I'm saying the universe wakes up through life. So you could see it as a sort of emergent panpsychism since life inevitably spreads. But the idea is that, you know, we're formed of matter, we're made of matter, and if you break us down to our fundamental units, you'll see all natural elements. And so if we get away from this dualism idea that there's something like, you know, a spirit that is, you know, disattached from material processes, then you see the emergence of life as the matter in the universe starting to become aware. And it does that by modeling the world around it. So it's actually the matter in the universe starts modeling the universe. And you could see that as nature modeling itself. So you have this self-reference concept again. So, you know, if you buy the argument in the book that evolution is progressive, such that it's sort of guaranteed that life will spread through the cosmos, you know, our civilization, our specific civilization may not succeed, but the book argues that we may fail, but life will win. Then you can see how it's actually the universe itself starting to wake up. And I think that's a pretty neat idea. So yeah, if you want to, you know, talk about that at all, or if you want to go to the complex adaptive systems topic, we can do that as well.
Yeah, sure. I know I find that the argument and the presentation of it in the book really fascinating and unique. Just the combinatory nature of all these different studies, and then consciousness being viewed the way you view it. It's not entirely panpsychist. It's not entirely materialistic or idealistic, and I like that because consciousness is such an enigma, and so many people define it in so many different ways that if you don't leave the door open to at least all of those options, at least keeping the main thread of consciousness going along, that this is what it's doing. It's a self-modeling of the universe. And then as far as rocks having an experience or humans, we know we do. It's not entirely, you know, understood if rocks do, but the thread of it makes sense to me. And I think that there's something unique too that seems to be like a selection force for atomic nuclei from atomic nuclei to atoms. And then you even get in the core of stars, you know, fusion of the nucleus together to form, you know, helium. And so it seems like there's really no reason unless it's just the strong and weak forces or gravity and electromagnetism, which nobody knows where those come from, but they're there. And those are what attract larger molecules together to form bigger ones. And then nuclear fusion occurs. And so you have this progressive from essentially what they assume as, you know, the basic elementary particles that are found in the collider, the super collider, to that being emergent with the strong and weak forces coming together. All of those things are driving towards a goal. It seems like they're inevitably, incrementally, and hierarchically trying to find their way towards a goal, including human life.
Yeah, I think so. And it's a really radically new way to look at nature. And some people might have problems with talking about, you know, subatomic particles having goals. So I think that's, you know, right and wrong. And it just, you know, we need to have a little bit of more nuance when we discuss these things. And you're displaying that nuance perfectly. But so when I said consciousness emerges with living systems and possibly systems with brains, I want to be clear that mind, in this more abstract sense that really refers just to information processing, um, emerges earlier. And that the fact that the universe inevitably gives rise to this process suggests that there's something like mind at a fundamental level. But I would really attribute that to the fine tuning of the physical constants and parameters, which gives rise to this whole process of consciousness emerging and spreading. So, for example, you have an oak tree that will, an oak seed that will inevitably evolve into a tree because it has this developmental program. Um, I think most people wouldn't say that the oak seed is conscious, but it does have mind and intelligence in the sense that there's this genetic program that sees that this evolutionary process will take place. So I believe that the fine tuning of the parameters of the universe, the laws and constants, play the role of something like cosmic DNA, and ensure that this sort of evolutionary program plays out that gives rise to consciousness spreading indefinitely.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that there's like some part of me, especially when I conceptualize these things, that places mind fundamental. In some cases, I've even considered the idea that mind is necessarily all that there really is, to take it to the furthest extreme. And that, of course, doesn't seem, that seems a little bit out there. And it also seems very difficult to prove. So it doesn't really seem to have a functionalistic reasoning to take that philosophy if it's not going to progress anything, I guess. But like, and to talk about the physical constants and matter in general, to be a little bit esoteric with it, I don't know if you've heard of Rupert Sheldrake, but he's argued that there's no such thing as physical constants, that they're constantly varying, and he's made these arguments that basically his arguments present this idea that matter, because if matter is the most real, then it's subjective feeling secondary to that. And it seems to me like all you can really know is your subjective feeling. And matter, it seems like no matter how much you break it down to its fundamental core, it's either a particle, a wave, it's spontaneously coming in and out of existence, it's in two places at once, it's somehow symmetrically attached through entanglement at mass distances. So it just seems like matter to me, if that's what we're going to say is the most fundamental aspect of everything, we don't even know what it is. We truly don't know.
Yeah. So yeah, if you really probe the idea of matter, you find that there's not matter. My cat, my cat's over. My cat's like trying to knock over my mic and soundboard. Let's hope he doesn't. Hey, buddy.
Well, see, the cat's conscious. At least we know that.
Yeah. Yeah, for better or for worse sometimes. Get out of here, buddy. So I don't think materialism is the right paradigm. So yeah, you have this new picture where consciousness emerges inevitably.
Yep.
But there seems to be some sort of fundamental intelligence to reality that gives rise to the process. Even if Sheldrake is right that the laws themselves evolve, which some like really respected physicists like Paul Davies and I think Lee Smolin have argued, there still has to be some sort of like meta laws that explain kind of the evolution of these laws that we're aware of.
Yeah.
I do think we're kind of faced with this new picture that I've called multi-level monism. And I'm probably not the first person to use that term, but the idea is that there's one nature, there's like a natural substance, I guess. And as that substance evolves, there are these different levels that emerge. So first matter emerges, and then subjective experience emerges, and then maybe there's some future emergence that we can't even comprehend. So yeah, I think we need to kind of get rid of the old divisions of like materialism and dualism. I will say that, it's kind of popular right now, trendy, I guess, similar in the way that panpsychism is trendy to this idea of like this new kind of idealism that people like Bernardo Kastrup and maybe to some extent Donald Hoffman are proposing. Um, but so I don't think it's the case that there's no external world. And I don't think they would argue that either exactly. Um, but when we talk about that external world and we try to zoom in on what those material objects are, things get strange because you do get to like the quantum level where there's, then possibly down to like fields and strings where it's not really material. But I do think that's external phenomena that does exist, and we deserve to call it that, and that our consciousness isn't creating all of reality in the way that some of those people describe, for the simple reason that, take the example of like you're running in the forest, right? And you have this conscious experience and suddenly you eat shit and you land on the ground because you tripped over a rock that you didn't see. So for the people that are claiming that consciousness creates reality, I don't understand how something external to you that you weren't even anticipating has this physical effect on you. And I think that poses a big problem for this idea that the physical world is just being generated by the mind in real time. I do think there's an external world and we emerge from those dynamics.
Yeah, no, and I think the same way when I think about when I actually talked with Donald Hoffman for quite a while, and when I broke this down with him, he subscribes to, or he's created, and very much to his intellectual credit, the idea of conscious realism, which is um, has some mathematics behind it that are way beyond my understanding, but he was able to, from what I understand, derive some of like the uncertainty principles, some of Schrodinger's equations, some of these fundamental equations like that describe EM fields and stuff from this idea of consciousness being a group of agents interacting, like a big network of conscious agents, and consciousness is what emerges from them. Anyway, it's hard for me to describe, but his dynamics, he was able to somehow arrive through mathematics at equations that are the exact same as the mathematical equations that describe the nature of quantum mechanics. And that's something I don't know too much about, but that, like you said, it's a new form of idealism similar to Kastroff, where who has his thing is analytical idealism. And I always hear him use the comparison of instrument cluster in an airplane and the pilot in a cockpit. And evolution has kind of granted us this ability to utilize our five senses as an instruments, as a speedometer, a tachometer, a humidity gauge. Basically, our senses act as that. And so it's not that the material world, in his view, is not real, but it's that we don't see it for what it really is. And so we merely get to see wind direction. We get to see a small, narrow band of the light, the spectrum of EM. So we can see narrow, like visible light. And we're equipped with some instruments to kind of navigate whatever it is that's reality. But however, without the mind observing it, yeah, it wouldn't, I don't think it's that it creates it so much so as it's always there. It's just whenever you observe it, you're using your instrument cluster and your senses to try to decipher what really is there, and it's ultimately not truly what it is. But that aside, it's just an interesting dynamic to think about, the possibility that, yeah, there needs to be an observer in order to have something exist, in order to create time. And so I guess the thing is some people probably think there's an eternal observer, an eternal mind that's observing. Or like Roger Penrose and them, I know, think that wave function collapse is random and happening without consciousness permitting it to happen. So your observation doesn't collapse the wave function. It's just that wave functions are constantly collapsing all around you. And your interaction with that somehow creates a conscious experience, almost like there's a particle that conveys consciousness between us and material, which is a pretty wild thought.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of really good ideas that come out of all those models of reality, and that we're getting closer and closer to understanding it. But yeah, I do think it's really important to understand that reality kind of emerges from this interplay between
Yeah.
conscious agents and the external world.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I agree. I agree.
And nothing has like so even if you acknowledge that the external phenomena around you are real, so like when I look at this bed next to me, there's it has a real structure such that if I walk in that direction, I'm going to hit it and it's going to stop me. So
Yeah.
there's real physical phenomena there, but does it have a color? Let's say, if it was something, and I think probably the oak has some sort of smell, like, does it have like, a scent or something? That all requires a conscious observer. So consciousness kind of elaborates whatever is there naturally and kind of paints this um more interesting picture of the world. So yeah, it's a lot to think about, and I think all of these people, whether they're panpsychists like Philip Goff, or illusionists like Keith Frankish, or idealists like Kastrup, or whatever you would call Penrose, that all of these people are kind of seeing something that's there, but they're not all right and not all wrong, and it's kind of up to us. Um, I would say the generalist of the world. So, people who aren't specialists working in these very particular fields because they sort of have tunnel vision. It's up to maybe even the non-scientists to, read all of these books and look at all these models and to kind of see what the story is that emerges from all of them. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're probably right. Like you said, they're so specialized and tunnel vision on what their subject matter expertise is. Like Roger Penrose being a physicist, of course, he's going to try to create a quantum conscious model. I mean, why would he not? That's what he knows, and also he thinks it's the most fundamental. So, of course, their contributions are going to be directly in correlation with what they already are investigating. So, that's what you mean by like complexity science. I think is all of these minds coming into one field and creating this study of consciousness is what we're studying is the complexification of life over time. What causes that? And despite entropy and the second law of thermodynamics, we exist in an open system. So we're exchanging energy with our environment. So we're able to combat entropy. And that's not it's not like a crazy idea to think, because like you mentioned and you clarify, the state of an entropic system is dependent upon whether or not it's open and closed. And then once you see through that, it's just interesting, because before that, I thought of entropy as a coffee cup cooling down. I never really, it's a big, huge part of looking at the entropy situation is that the postulate that you highlight, which is the open and closed system, that is so often not thought about in the second law. And I just think it's so crazy. When I read that, I was like, you know what, this is kind of weird that nobody's highlight, which is great you did. It's just, it really helps invert the entropy landscape that kind of prevents people from being able to understand how complexity could be fit into that.
Yeah, I think framing the story of the universe, of evolution and the universe in this way, in terms of there's this second law of thermodynamics. Well, when you start talking about that, there's different versions of the second law and different versions of entropy, but this basic idea of systems naturally becoming more disordered. So if you put like a drop of ink in a cup of water, you will see the ink naturally disperse. You won't see the ink come back and form that blob. So that is a natural way for systems to behave that aren't bound together in any way. So I think it is really an exciting way to frame the story, that you have this kind of dual dynamic where you have the second law of thermodynamics, and then you have adaptive systems that are trying to persist against that. And that is how complexity arises and matures. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah. I think, yeah, I think so. I think you mentioned earlier cosmic DNA, and I think there's something wildly unique about DNA. And obviously, I mean, it's structure in itself, the double helix and the hydrogen bonding, and the unique nature of having a sugar in the. It's just a wild molecule, and it's all made up of four different,
Nucleotide.
nucleotides. Yeah, there you go. And those four nucleotides create a code that essentially is the only thing that separates our phenotype from a turtle. Is that our code was read differently by its transcription agents to produce proteins that make a human. But essentially, you can just rearrange four digits in this paradigm, and you would get a turtle or something. And that's just wild to think about, that the reduction of biological life down to DNA, and that DNA itself is, because I've been formulating a definition in my head of a vitalistic kind of consciousness, where consciousness seems to me to be the force that mediates between an organism's homeostatic drives and its ultimate actualizing goals, and how to go about choosing those goals. But essentially, it's the fundamental animating force that drives an organism to move towards a goal, is a thesis that I was trying to put together for myself about consciousness. And that makes it seem vitalistic and kind of like there's this life force. But anyways, what's your
I
thoughts
think
on
that's,
DNA
yeah. What's
in
your
this?
thoughts on what?
What was your thoughts on that and DNA in general?
Yeah. So, I think that's fine. I think, so Henry Bergson had this idea of the élan vital, and Teilhard Chardin, Desjardins had a similar idea, radial energy, he called it, and Aristotle had entelechy and telos. I think these ideas were all right. So, there are a lot of people who thought that this was this élan vital, this vitalism, was this sort of mystical force. Um, but when these notions were being created, we didn't have any concept of information. And so there was no language to talk about whatever, this thing that you're seeing is in a scientific language. So I don't think it's that vitalism was wrong. I think vitalism was basically the theory of life being driven by information and information processing and integration, and that we'll see that a lot of these ideas were actually right, because vitalism is just agency, and living organisms behave different than inanimate systems. A rock will only move if it's acted on by an external force, where living organism moves in a way where you basically describe it as being goal oriented. You can't use Newtonian mechanics to um, predict the movement of a living system. Now, we know it's not magic. We know that basically the system is being powered by metabolism. It is eating some source of food, or if it's a plant, it's absorbed sunlight. So it's being powered by, physical forces that we can understand, but it has this telos, or goal oriented behavior, purposeful movement, that can only be understood in terms of information. So these are informational systems. Just to go back to what you were saying about the second law, because yeah, I kind of lost my train of thought when I was answering that. But when we understood the second law of thermodynamics, at a molecular or atomic level, because when the second law was first understood, it was just about heat transfer, like you said, like things cooling off. But it was really with like Ludwig Boltzmann that we started to understand it at an atomic level. And so he had this model of a gas in a box, and you can imagine all of the gas particles being clumped up in one region of that box. If it starts off that way, if that's the initial state of the system, it's going to spread out. It's going to become more disordered. The pattern is going to kind of dissolve. So the reason that we have this big misunderstanding of the second law, and we try to apply it to everything, like the universe as a whole, is because we were really just, basing it off this really simple model of a gas in a box. And beyond that, in Boltzmann's model, it was assumed that there was molecular chaos. So this was his H theorem, but basically this transition from order to disorder requires that the elements in the system don't become correlated. They don't bond to each other. They just move about randomly. And if you have a system moving about randomly, you will have this order to disorder transition. But that's really only applicable for isolated systems. And so when you have an open system that's open to flows of energy from the environment, then the system doesn't show those dynamics at all. And so it was really with it probably started before him, but Ilya Prigogine, the Belgian biochemist, started doing this work probably in like the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s, got really popular. But it was this idea of non-equilibrium thermodynamics. So equilibrium thermodynamics was looking at these closed systems and systems that were at or near equilibrium. But these open systems that are open to flows of energy, you see that if you have energy flowing through a system or some sort of gradient, so some sort of difference in, for example, temperature between two systems, you will see these organized structures called dissipative structures spontaneously form. So when we take the plug out of the bathtub, you'll get the formation of a whirlpool. You get the formation of hurricanes because of the temperature difference between the warm ocean and the colder upper atmosphere. So this provided a basic model that could start to get us from the inanimate world to something like an organized system. And so the idea that I describe in part 1 of the book on the origin of life is that the Earth was this basically this planetary system that had all of this excess free energy. So geochemical energy was built up by these geochemical processes, and that basically life is something like a dissipative structure that unlocked those energy reservoirs and allowed energy to flow, because energy wants to naturally flow. That's just what thermodynamics really is, the science of energy flow. And that organic chemistry, the chemistry that underlies life, really provides all these new pathways for this energy that was locked up to flow through. So the idea, and it's based on the work of Eric Smith at the Santa Fe Institute and his collaborator Harold Morowitz, that life, that an Earth with life is actually a more thermodynamically stable state than a lifeless Earth. So the idea is that yeah, this flow of energy through these molecular systems start to organize that system, and over time you start to get an autocatalytic set, which is a self-sustaining chemical network. And at some point, you start to get the formation of genetic material. So something like DNA. So you mentioned DNA, and it probably started off with RNA before DNA. So you start kind of with metabolism. You have this chemical reaction network that is extracting energy from the environment and using that to sort of amplify the system. And after metabolism comes some sort of genetic material like RNA, which can act as a store of information, but also play the role of like proteins. So it can like catalyze reactions. And so, yeah, but why should give rise to these information processing systems? I think that goes back to this, larger question of this kind of like fine tuning of the parameters. Yeah, it's certainly strange that if from a completely like materialist kind of like atheist nihilistic perspective, why something like that should arise. I think it's, baked into this recipe of evolution, um, such that the whole universe is, you know, the dynamics lead to these information processing systems, and that you know the nature of physical reality does have this goal where it's producing information processing systems and then conscious systems. So you get this kind of model of reality of the universe is kind of self-actualizing. And I think that's really interesting. And, when I think you look at all of the different sciences and the bigger picture in totality, you do get this picture of a purposeful universe heading towards some possibly ultimate goal state, some sort of cosmic attractor where maybe something like a cosmic mind emerges after life has spread throughout the universe and forms this sort of integrated mind at a cosmic level.
Yeah, like, that's a good description. That was well said. I enjoyed that.
But
Because I think it's hard. It's a hard thing to explicate. And you do a good job of doing it, especially right there. That does kind of help understand where your philosophy lies, and it is intuitively sensical. It really is. But like you said, the atheist nihilistic standpoint is, of course, accidental, random collisions create all of that materialism. Your stance is a very nice way for science to join the club in some of these philosophical endeavors and have a landing spot for consciousness, not necessarily brain centered, but universally centered somewhere. At least a way to bridge the gap between complete nihilistic materialism and the inability to get all the way to a creation and creator. At least there's a ground by which people can migrate away from the night, because I think that it's important to preserve meaning throughout these kinds of conversations, and especially with philosophical titans that are in the media, not tight, I mean, of the past, of course, like Aristotelian and stuff and all that. But modern day, you've got philosophers like Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, people like that, whose philosophies are overtly nihilistic, which is fine. And they're very useful. And I find a lot of help from reading them. But I think it's really important, really, to preserve some of the meaning that's behind life in order to not be detrimental to others with your work. And that's just it's an important facet of it.
yeah, I think probably Sam Harris certainly sees it that kind in that those sort of nihilistic terms, and people like Jerry Coyne. But I actually think people like Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett, if you really probed them about these questions and laid out the evidence, I think they'd be open to this and are showing that they're open to this. Someone wrote a book called, I think it's called Believing in Dawkins, but it kind of is all about how Dawkins has this kind of spirituality in most of his writing that's kind of showing this narrative of purpose, even though he doesn't believe in some, supernatural entity. I think what happened with Dawkins and Dennett mostly is that they were battling organized religion, and the systems that want to keep evolution out of schools. So I think there's this culture war that was going on and still is to some degree between science and religion that caused scientists to kind of take this atheistic stance because they felt that they had to fight the other side. But I think now we're getting this new type of spirituality that's emerging that a lot of scientists are open to, as long as you explain everything in naturalistic terms.
Yeah.
And I think the picture that's emerging is certainly not the old picture where it was just this static universe or a universe of being. It's a universe of becoming. And by that, I mean, we live in a creative universe. And so the universe isn't just this arbitrary system of randomly interacting particles. It's actually something like an emergence generator. It generates novelty and patterns continuously. And so I think we, need a new story. And basically, it's this story of this kind of dialectic between complexity and this tendency towards disorder that allows us to understand these emergences. And really, the picture is one of hierarchical emergence and recursive self-organization. So those are a lot of big words, but by that, I mean the fundamental units in nature interact and they come together to form a larger functional entity, like molecules coming together to form a single-celled organism. And then those organisms come together to form multicellular organisms. And then some of those organisms come together to form societies. And now we have this, something like a global brain that's emerging on the earth. That's the interconnected network of humans connected by the internet and their devices. So I think that's really the story of nature in reality, is this story of recursive emergence where these hierarchical systems are being built by the evolutionary process. And I see no reason why this process shouldn't continue. And so when you kind of zoom out, you would see this sort of self-replication process at the level of planets or biospheres. So if we terraform Mars, we would try to put life on Mars, and then to make that planet habitable, we would need to fill it with plant life that would create an atmosphere with oxygen. And if this process of life leaving the planet is something that's sort of built in to the process, if you see life as this phenomenon called adaptive complexity, which just learns naturally because reality is always presenting it with these challenges that it's adapting to and learning from, then you see this process of organisms emerging and spreading as being this multi-scale process. So when you talk about complex adaptive systems, that's what I think is really important. An important contribution from that field is that complex adaptive systems, or you could call it organisms, don't just exist at this one scale. Humans come together and form social systems, and the dynamics of those social systems are very similar to the organisms that it's made of. And there's a lot of new, formal work coming out from people like Carl Friston and Maxwell Ramstad that show that societies or even economic systems are themselves acting out a process that basically allows the system to persist against this tide of entropic decay.
Gotcha. Yeah, that idea of the universe consistently becoming something indicates like a final causality, like that in the situation of trying to establish purpose and meaning, or if that exists at all in a goal-oriented system, and if consciousness is the mediating agent between what I should do now versus what I have to do to survive, like eat and sleep, and then you have this mediator. It's like everything is trying to become something. Like you just said, it's even an individual agent such as you or myself or somebody else. We all persist through our life till we decay and die. So we're entropically disordering ourselves. I mean, our body is falling apart. The telomeres are shortening. The replication of the cells, mitosis, is constantly adding extra codons in there. And then you've got all these problems that are inevitable to occur over time, unless you interrupt it with some weird thing. But if you don't do that, then you've got that. But ultimately, throughout that, we are aware of the death at the end and this increasingly chaotic disorder within our own bodies. But we still orient towards a goal anyways, because of some final cause. We're trying to become something. And so it's like, if I take, like you said earlier, if I take another job somewhere else, and if I was married or had kids, I would want to get a better job because of why? Because that's nested in my desire to be a good father or a good husband. Well, why do I want to be a good father and a good husband? Well, because I want to be a good person. Well, why do you want to be a good person? Well, that net, like Russian doll style nesting of values in a hierarchy. Eventually, you get to, well, why do you want to be a good person? Well, what is a good person, and where does that final cause lead? So there's this final. Thomas Aquinas, a Middle Ages theologian and philosopher, would have described this final causality. This idea that everything is working ultimately, despite its decay, towards a superordinate or a transcendent goal that obviously is above and beyond being. Essentially, that these ideas of truth and everything that people seek they have a transcendent aspect that's above and beyond what we can. And inevitably, it almost is admitting that by doing any kind of science, it seems to me like there's an admittance that there is something transcendent about what you're searching for. Because if you're looking for truth, it can't be within the matter you're looking at. Why are you trying to find the truth? Where is the truth? Well, it's got to be omnipresent and continual, despite whatever the truth may be. You're looking for it, I would assume, because you're looking at an amoeba for 10 hours. Who does that? Why would you do that? Because you think something transcendent from the amoeba that's true about the amoeba's movement or something like that.
Yeah, yeah, very well said. It's interesting that Thomas Aquinas took Aristotle's philosophy. He was heavily influenced by Aristotle, and I think Aristotle was right about a lot of things. And it's interesting that that might be part of the success of Christianity, was that kind of teleological worldview. But yeah, there is this drive, and this drive is ultimately due to this intrinsic process of complexification that I think is the process of the universe. It's not this static thing that's becoming increasingly disordered. It's this thing that's becoming more and more complex, and life and consciousness are the drivers of this complexification process. So yeah, it's a whole new different view of reality, and once you grasp it, then suddenly everything seems a bit different. Everything's not meaningless, and it kind of infuses your life with purpose, because you see yourself as being part of this civilization that's ultimately, even without knowing, trying to get off the planet and spread through the cosmos and contribute to the emergence of something higher. And so for me, it's a really big paradigm shift, and maybe the most important one, because all the different paradigm shifts from like Copernicus to Galileo and Newton and Darwin, they were all necessary steps in understanding this process, as well as the evolution of religious ideologies. But now, we're seeing this mechanistic view that has a lot of the qualities that you saw from the religious ideologies and the ideas, but we're understanding it in naturalistic terms. So I think that's part of the evolutionary process too, the evolution of paradigms. But I think this is maybe the most profound paradigm shift, because we're realizing that there is this goal-oriented process, and that we actually play a significant role in that process. And I think that can be really transformative.
Oh, absolutely. I do too. I think that putting that essentially a way of saying that is that you're giving the inherent dignity of the human organism, the self that everybody has, its due respect. And I think when that's lost, that's whenever you see societally and structurally and geopolitically, you see regimes rise and fall, and you see tyrants come about and inevitably collapse. That's always something to do with that, to where the individual human's meaning is reduced to a mere cog in a machine of a mechanism, or, a big Rube Goldberg machine ultimately to accomplish some task that's not even a task worth accomplishing. And what you're saying is, yeah, that our consciousness, which we each have an individual version of, it grants us, each individual, despite their intellect, their height, whatever, their socioeconomic, all of that, they're granted that, at least by the sake of having an existent conscious self, that they're an integral part in the puzzle of this movement, and that your goal-oriented actions now ultimately affect how this whole thing plays out. So it's important to do good to advance the knowledge of the human species, because we're ultimately trying to evolve. And so it doesn't, a lot of times these philosophies and stuff like consciousness can take the notion of free will and reduce it down to nothing and all of that. And that doesn't do anything good for anybody to do that. It just doesn't, to tell somebody they don't have free will. People can hear that, and then all of a sudden they have an excuse not to. So it's just, even if that is true, there's no reason for people to be saying it. And there's no, and additionally, like what you mentioned about science and religion, it's like, to me, it was like science started trying to tread into territory of ontology and epistemology and stuff where they don't even need to be. It was like, well, we never asked the scientists why we existed. We asked maybe how, or if I push this book across the table, how long will it take for it to stop sliding? I mean, we asked scientists those questions. Nobody ever asked them, why does this book exist? But for some reason, they started answering that question anyways. They started saying, and so it created a false dichotomy of and it really led to this completely innocuous debate of science and religion, which has been nothing but a useless talk, because you're talking about philosophy on one side. The core base is an argument on philosophy, and they're debating the embryonic development of a child versus the creation of the universe. And they're just not debating evolution. And, it's just a complete and utter false dichotomy that's led to just endless amounts of discussions that just repeat themselves without getting anywhere.
Yeah. So, I do think scientists should try to answer these questions, but in doing so, I think they need to evolve from being just scientists to scientists, philosophers. And there's always certain philosophical and metaphysical assumptions, even, that you make when doing science. And the idea that there's no agency or free will itself is a metaphysical assumption. And it's really based on hard determinism, the idea that there are these particles and they're just following these mechanical trajectories. And that's just the whole story. So you mentioned it being bad, telling people, that there's no free will. I agree. It's, studies have shown that it's really bad. People who were convinced that they don't have free will on a subsequent test were more likely to cheat because they felt like they weren't personally responsible. It can lead to depression, lower quality of life if you don't believe you have any agency. But the real bad part about it is it's just not true. So we know that at the most fundamental level, there's indeterminism. In quantum mechanics, it's been shown that reality is indeterministic, and that means that there's not this strict story of cause and effect that's just like dominoes falling, where there's no room for any sort of agency or creativity. That's not the case. And when you understand that there's some what they call causal slack in this chain of cause and effect, and then you have agents emerging, which are these information processing systems that can climb uphill against the force of gravity, that you don't see that with inanimate objects, then you see that agency is a very important part of the whole cosmic evolutionary story. And it's actually required for this complexification process to continue. It continues through life and higher intelligence and consciousness. So yeah, I have beef with people like Sam Harris and Sabine Hossenfelder, people who are just saying that free will isn't a scientific idea. That's not right. And there's lots of, the world's most respected neuroscientists, people like Giulio Tononi and Christoph Koch, just put out a paper showing that there is free will, and it's our minds that exert influence on the physical world. Of course, the mind is emergent from the brain, and there's no, new physical substance. But there is this integrated system that can actually push back on the world. It's not the atoms just bumping into each other, knocking each other around. You have what's called downward causation or whole part causation. So basically the whole, which is this pattern of information, starts having causal power. So yeah, the record needs to be corrected. I think those people need to come out and say we were wrong, or at least the way we were framing things wasn't correct. And maybe there's some truth to what we were saying, but this whole idea of agency is real and based on, naturalistic, mechanistic processes. Because I've met people, whether they're, non-scientists, who've written me after I've written, articles on free will, saying like, they had so much distress and existential angst thinking that they have no agency, but also, really well-respected neuroscientists. You had Adam Safran on your channel, and he was talking about this a bit, but, he's expressed that to me as well. This, I went through a similar experience where, when you think hard determinism is the only truth and you take that seriously, it can be very disturbing, because that means that you have no agency, no ability to change the outcome of the future. That's another big problem, because it kind of not only makes people feel like they're not agents, but it makes them feel like they have no control over the outcome of the world, and that the world may be doomed. A lot of these people are saying that as well. And that can be a really disturbing idea that's not even true. So once you realize that you do have agency, suddenly there seems to be all of the, possibility in the world to create the future that we want to see.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think that was extremely well said. I'm glad that you said it that way too, because I've never conversed with somebody on free will who took the stance as objectively, well, a couple people maybe, but as objectively as you have just then on what the implications of such a thought pattern are. And if you trickle that downstream of just individual agency, you could see how that ideology could trickle into the mass propagandizing of a populace, leading to something as such as terrible as the Soviet Gulag or the Third Reich or something, because essentially it comes down to the dehumanization of the individual. Well, what's the precursor to doing that? Well, first you've got to explain that the individual has no causal ability. Then it's easier. These are easy. It makes, tyrannical things never happen in one giant leap. It's always turning the heat up on the frog over time until it's boiling. And so I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist here and say that that's what happens. I'm just trying to make a causal connection between social organizations and institutions that lead to tyranny and dehumanization of the individual. They have to have a landing place to get there and slowly and subtly build their case. They can't just go from one day to, we have a bunch of causal agents here and it's a democratic society, to you're all in cattle cars and you're going to a camp. There's got to be a middle ground. And what that middle ground is, you have no self, you have no free will. It's just, it leads to me it's not religious inquiry or anything. It's just not philosophically a good way to explain everything to the population, like you just said. And so I agree.
Yeah, it's a bad and harmful ideology. But so when you have this sort of paradigm shift, you do see reality as, being more meaningful. But I should say that it doesn't mean that, you have this sort of awakening experience and you're like, oh, I have to work on technology. I have to work on like something that's going to help life progress to like spread through the cosmos. That's not the case. So in the book, I explained that, these higher level systems are complex adaptive systems as well, like the global brain that's forming, human civilization as a whole is something like a giant, like social organism or super organism. And so you can start to talk about social systems, economic systems. You can start to think about the optimal configuration, and you can base that idea of the optimal configuration on what you know about the optimal configuration for like biological organisms. So we know that complexity and computational power is a function of two things. It's a function of how many parts you have and how integrated those parts are. But all the parts can't be the same. So it's really a function of integration and the diversity of component parts. So you can't get a living system out of all just, one atom. Like all carbon atoms couldn't form life. You need a diversity of molecules because they play something like a division of labor. For, the human organism, there's over 200 cell types in the body. So you see this diversity of components. And in a society wouldn't do well. It wouldn't be functional. It wouldn't be adaptive if everybody in society had the same role. If everybody was a doctor, or if everybody was an engineer, even it wouldn't be the optimal configuration. If everybody was a musician or an artist, we need that diversity to allow for a division of labor and ultimate or optimal functionality and computational power. So simply by contributing to the diversity of ideas in human civilization, let's say you want to create a song that, has some abstract meaning that resonates with everyone. And, songs have this ability to sort of harmonize our actions. Everybody's listening to it on the radio or watching YouTube videos at the same time, and they're getting that message, and that's kind of giving them their own sort of like resonant frequency. So it's kind of entraining society. So my point is that just being an individual and just trying to be creative, that on its own is contributing to this process. So it's not like this awakening necessarily means like you have to like be working towards like higher intelligence or technological sophistication. Just contributing to the diversity of ideas is doing something really important for society.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree. I think that, yeah, it doesn't, that experience doesn't necessarily mean that you have to become this immediate cog in trying to push forward the human civilization just because you've come to this philosophical worldview, of course. But it definitely seems to be a really good, intriguing exposition that you've put together on this. And I think that it's a integral, probably, bridge to build in order to get to wherever we're going. And this, I see like your perspective in your book and your work and what you're explicating is all a necessary tool or necessary transition almost from this false dichotomy of ontology versus science and science versus evolution. All these things, it's got to become a more philosophical, like you said, a philosophically imbued conversation, and complex, like the complexity science of getting all of these different types of schools of thought to work together to create a science of consciousness and all of that. That wasn't something that was too on the radar. It didn't seem like in science 15 years ago. And I think work like you've put together here and what we've just discussed is a really neat integral part of getting to whatever the next stage is of conversation and dialogue around the nature of existence and meaning, and get away from the consistent and utter arguments of evolution versus Christianity or something, because that's gotten old. And I think I just wanted to say that, and I wanted to say I see your book as being a key point in advancing that dialogue. And I think it's kind of an incredible work that you've put together, and also the intent behind what you're trying to do is very noble. So I wanted to say that, and I wanted to thank you. I know it's getting close to 1 o'clock, so I was going to let you go, but I wanted to say thank you and recap all that, and just say I appreciate your time today.
Well, thanks a lot. That was a really lovely recap. And I appreciate you having me here.
Yeah.
And yeah, I hope this paradigm put forth in the book and in other people's books, people like Stuart Kaufman of Santa Fe Institute, builds a bridge between the secular and the spiritual world, because I think there's lots of room for spirituality in science. Spirituality doesn't have to refer to anything like supernatural or non-scientific. We see that the natural process of complexification and the spread of consciousness is itself a very spiritual thing. So yeah, thanks for having me on. If people want to read more about this work, I have a Road to Omega Substack that's kind of trying to apply these principles to, our understanding of like how to help society, and, sort of self-help aspect, even like how can we optimize our own lives by, understanding this paradigm. There's going to be a lot of content coming soon. There's only a few posts up so far. There's also a Road to Omega YouTube channel. And if anyone orders the book and sends me a screenshot of a receipt with their address to theromanceofreality@gmail.com, I'll send them a book plate, which is a little signed sticker that can go in the inside of the book. Yeah, so thank you so much for having me, Ethan. This has really been fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I hope we could talk again in the future. And I want to say that I will link all of those. I will link quite a bit of in the description, and also do like a little intro to this video explaining the name of your book, where to buy it, what it kind of is about. And then I'll put links to all of that in the description.
That'd be great.
So people can navigate to your social media, find your book, and then also find out ways by which to go about integrating these kinds of insights into a practical landscape of being. And so I'll certainly link all of that down below, and highly recommend it, of course, as well. But yes, I'll do that. And once again, Dr. Azarian, thank you so much for joining me. And I will hopefully talk to you again in the future, and we can extrapolate on some of these topics some more.
Yeah, let's do it again. That'd be fun.
Excellent. Thank you, Bobby. Have a good day.
All right. Take care.
Take care.